room of people, and hello everybody over there. Am I able to speak? Oh, so that's great. So we've got people in the room and outside of the room, which is super. Yeah, so a heartfelt thanks then for everybody who's come to listen to this. I'd also just like to say thanks to David for continued work in leadership on CCDS and for enabling us to engage with these seminars, with the conference that we've got coming and all of that activity. And I think in any kind of organisation where you can have a sustained attempt at engaging, it's very, very important that we can keep those things going, and that's worked well. I do want to say a few words just about the slides. So I've got just some very, very simple slides, but there is a background image to the slides which might run a little bit of interference. So I just want to talk about that very briefly. The slides were based on a piece of art practice. I would describe it as art practice, where I was engaging with the broad areas of need from our Special Educational Needs Code of Practice. Within the Code of Practice we have 4 areas of need that basically use deficit language to describe problems that children might have in their education. I was very interested in the way that these ideas dominate our discourses in education, and the art practice here was around quite a literal approach actually around binding those broad areas of need, thinking about ways that those could be bound, and also using retraction, so thinking about how some of the language would be retracted and some of those ideas would be rewritten. So it isn't, those aren't directly relevant to the presentation, but I've used them as a background, and I think it's important to recognise that pervading discourse that we're working with, particularly when we're working in the area of formalised compulsory art education, that when art education meets disability, it is within the framework of that special education discourse. So that was just a few words just about the slides. I do also just want to recognise that my work within the department is obviously informed by disability studies, but I'm an arts educator originally. My background is in art education. So I'm a member of the National Society for Education in Art and Design, and also INSEA, which is the International Society for Education through Art and Design. I'm also joint co-editor of IJADE, which is the International Journal of Art and Design Education. And I just make those things known so that we can just make some connections there, particularly for people, our international colleagues. So, having said all that, I'm about ready to go, I think. I've structured the talk in 5 parts. So part 1, argument and definitions. Part 2, a word about futurity. Part 3, plural histories of art education and disability. Part 4, I move to the idea of subjects on the edge. Part 5, concluding with dystopian and utopian futures. And I thought it's useful sometimes to structure in this way. If you're flagging a bit and you know that we've got to part 3, then you know we're on the downhill, and it helps you just maybe to think through where we are. So I'll move first of all then to arguments and definitions. I am going to largely read this paper, and I will maybe come out of that at various points, but it's just worth noting that I will read this predominantly. So, part 1, arguments and definitions. This paper stems from work on a larger project that aims to explore parallel histories of art education and disability, in England more particularly, from around 1830 and until the present, although obviously this work on futurity takes us beyond. And it's informed by that Foucauldian genealogical approach, looking at the emergence of discourses in those areas. My argument, one of the arguments that I'm going to present, is that histories of art, education and disability are and have been read separately. And I propose that, those histories have been read separately. I propose a plural reading, therefore, to enable a comprehensive understanding of the emergence of false separations that are contradictory to art's future capacities to educate. So the argument basically is around this separation, which I'm arguing is it's an unfruitful separation. It's an artificial separation that has been reinforced throughout historical ideas. Now, I do want to just talk a little bit about the idea about definitions, particularly as we're talking about this move from history through to present and the future, and the idea that we've got these flexible, constantly shifting sets of definitions that we're working with. Ideas about what has been, what is now, are vital in our exploration of what might come to be, past, present and future. The past appears solid, confirmed and established. Our present is shifting and future always uncertain, although we know that the past is just as uncertain a place as the future. Definitions of art education and disability are understood in our present context. We look back and project from our current situation. An evolution of art education can be read with and through moments that shift our understanding of disability. And I'll use the example here of Marxist readings. For example, they would acknowledge the significant influence of capitalism on the production of art education. And we can make very direct connections here with foundational work in disability studies by Michael Oliver, recognising the significance of social and material conditions for the creation of disablement. So we've had this shared history. And I would say actually that the idea around the influence of capitalism on our compulsory formal education is something that runs throughout this presentation. This moment, an elusive now, our present always, slipping into a future, frames our definitions and conceptualizations of what has been and what can come to be. There can be a danger then of imposing present definitions and ethical and moral judgments on a very different past. And this might limit our conceptualizations also of what we can become, because we're unable to imagine a world that differs very significantly from our own. So think about then our three terms here, or ideas that I want to work with: art, education and disability. And these three ideas have been defined in very different ways over time. So art, we might think about making, fine art, drawing, painting, craft, technical training, spiritual growth, morality, usefulness, individual creativity, well-being, colouring in. Education could be about learning, societal good, personal freedoms, liberation, neoliberal productivity, regulation, competition, control. And disability we can think in terms of impairment, personal tragedy, being socially produced, related to identity, imposed, regulated, dis/ability, concerned with ableism. As definitions have shifted, so too have the relationships between these three different elements. So on the board here I've got the main arguments, but also then art plus education plus disability. We could have a different sum. Art plus education can equal disability, but we might also think about disability arts equaling education. And I just want to set up that idea about the range of different definitions and how those might emerge over time. So I'm moving now to part 2 to think a little bit about this word futurity, a word about futurity. And I've got a quote on the slide which I will read. I'm coming to that after I've proposed the discussion. So future may be perceived of as this distant sci-fi future, barely recognisable utopian or dystopian dream worlds that sit beyond our understanding and beyond our control. And actually I was conscious about this with my rather dull slides, that they were working with this sort of dystopian grey future that we might all be lurching towards. But the future is also more immediate. And I wanted to think about this nature of futurity. It is the now and now and now. So we always are working in and stepping into this idea of the future. And this more immediate grasp on the future might give us more control in terms of thinking about our agency, this acknowledgement that our future is always within the present and moving slightly beyond, but with that present is important. So futurity, I want to just spend a moment exploring the idea of futurity, a future time, hinting at our continued existence. Humans have a predisposition towards the future, fortunately. Some call it planning, others might just refer to it as thinking. I'm going to introduce work now by Franco Biffo Berardi from the book And, Phenomenology of the End, to help us to think about futurity. And Berardi draws on work by Deleuze and Guattari, who in their metaphor of the rhizome reject notions of the beginning and the end. They suggest that we are always in the middle of something, where to be is supplanted by a continuity, and. Berardi then refers to the future as immanent, that it's contained in the now. We're concerned then with what the present reveals about the future. And I'll go to the quote on the slide now. The future, he says, is inscribed in the present structure of the world as a range of possibilities, as a tendency that we can imagine, sense, and perceive, although we cannot clearly see it. Prophecy, indeed, is a sort of premonition, a vibratory sense of intuition that gives us the possibility of feeling the future as tendency. The present state of the world can be described as the vibratory occurrence of many possibilities. How will chaotic vibration give birth to the event? Why is it, among all possibilities of development, one of them prevails? Why is it, among all possibilities of development, one of them prevails? And I want to take that now into exploring some histories of art education, to think about that idea about futurity and why it is that particular trajectories take hold and others maybe don't. Is everybody all right? Is everybody, are you all right over there?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Good to know. So, part 3, and this is a slightly lengthier section now, relating to histories of art education and disability. And again, the argument here is that disability has been occluded, is largely absent from histories of art education. And this is a problem, I would argue, if we want to think about art education and disability futurity. Our educational imagination has been reduced by the exclusion of body minds that might have shaped the landscape of art education. And I'd argue that this is a very real consequence of our segregated education system. The removal of particular body minds from our thinking about art and education. Histories of art education suggest that we fail to take account of what Mitchell, Snyder and Ware refer to as peripheral embodiments. And I'm taking that term from their work on the biopolitics of disability. An art education historian, Mervyn Romans, wrote that there were 5 key histories of art education, and these offer a corroborative and entrenched view of the emergence of art education from early fine art academies and design schools. Romans argued for a revision of this history, yet still fails to take account of disability. And the 5 key histories that he refers to are Clive Ashwin's work in 1975, which referred to policy from the 1700s all the way through to 1975. Quentin Bell's work on design schools, Richard Carline, Draw They Must, Gordon Sutton's work in 1967, and Stuart MacDonald's work on philosophy and history of art education in 1970. And obviously just hearing those dates, we can see that work is taking place in the 60s and early 70s. And it's problematic that we've got this reification of a particular history of art education. And I think this is evident in Ashwin's introduction in 1975, when he writes about his rationale for the collection that he's put together. He says this book provides a collection of edited extracts from documents which relate to the development of art and design education in Britain, with commentaries on the contents of the documents and their historical context. And then he goes on to say documents have been selected for inclusion on the grounds of their relevance to the development of art education. Now obviously as historians or as academics we always are selective about what we do, but I think that's a really useful articulation of this idea about material being selected for particular relevance. And we can see then that this idea about history is formulated through those selections, but also through what's omitted. Histories of art education and disability are written, but these are parallel rather than intersecting. I've argued elsewhere that a plural reading reveals intersections and influences that might otherwise be ignored. The inclusion of disability history from histories of art education results in the emergence and reinforcement of art education as a system of ableist practices. A bold statement which many art educators might take us to task on, but we'll put it out there for now anyway. So I'm going to take a particular example now of the emergence of formalised art education in England during the early 19th century. The shared history of art education and disability is very clear in what I'm describing as this mid-industrial age. Michael Oliver identifies the Industrial Revolution as key in producing conditions for disablement. This corresponds with a significant time in the evolution of art education. Capitalist industrialisation forms the defining context for art education and disability. At the beginning of the 19th century, art and design education was a central concern at the level of governmental intervention. It's really very difficult to comprehend anybody who's working in the arts more broadly and in art education specifically, the marginalisation, which I'll talk to later. But to think that at this time that there were government committees that were set up to address the centrality of art, design and craft education. So it was a very much a central concern because of industrialisation, because of technical production and manufacture. So at the beginning of 19th century, we saw this great influence in terms of governmental control in terms of art education. Art education in fine art academies was recognised as having limited influence on design and manufacture. At this time, and as a result of perceived market demands, the emphasis started to shift from fine art academies into manufacture and design schools. Art and design education began to emerge as ocular-centric in prioritising particular forms of vision and visuality. Now, we could obviously argue that prior to that, there's a long history in terms of fine art traditions which would suggest that vision and visuality has been central to all kinds of fine art practice, going back, well beyond sort of 1830. But I want to say a little bit more about this role, the role of vision, ocular centricity and ocular normativity that started to take hold within that design education. So just to say a little bit more about this. A concern with poor quality design in England and the potential threat from superior European designs gave rise to an increased interest in the need to formalise art and design education for future makers, but also for consumers of design. We can't help but just note the irony of this constant relationship that we have with Europe. And this, don't mention Brexit. I won't. It was one of those words that I should have said I wasn't going to mention. However, French and German design work was heralded as superior and from a superior set of traditions. As a result, art and design education was recognised as being of national importance with an emphasis on the need to move towards high quality design. The method and approach for achieving this was defined by working from nature and applying this to manufacture, and resulted in a significant emphasis on working from direct observation and on this idea of good drawing. In 1836, in the report of the Select Committee of Arts and Manufactures, Henry Sass, teacher of art and painting, reported that the basis of art and design is the delineation of objects through geometry, arts and perspective. Perspective was described as being of particular importance since its principles can never be too scrupulously observed, this is a quote, to deviate in any case is to violate natural propriety and sacrifice to a fallacious pretext of taste the certainty of truth and science. So just to say, this alignment with vision, visuality, the idea around sight, truth, knowledge of God, knowledge of nature, all of those things we saw coming through in the work of John Ruskin, for example, but this was very much embedded in this art tradition. Art manufacture and science were given equal status at the time, not, very, very different to the situation we're in now. So ocular centricity then gives way to ocular normativity, and I make particular use of David Bolt's concept here, since an art and design education without vision emerges as incomprehensible and beyond the cultural imagination. So that was one reading from those 5 texts around art, design, craft education around that time. But I want to then look at this parallel history and consider a little bit of local history. So consider now then some local history of the Royal School for the Blind, which was established in 1791 as the Liverpool Asylum for the benefit of the indigent blind. It offered a place for technical training, so predominantly that was a place for training for adults. Liverpool at the time had a massive growing population. There were real issues in terms of poverty, poor conditions for industrial classes. There was an influx of people from Ireland as a result of famine and oppressive regulation through the Corn Laws, and a recognition that an infrastructure of support, training and education was required. So we see from 1791 up to, as I'm saying, talking now around 1830, this growth and development in institutions to support the poor, but also educational training institutions. By 1830, the curriculum of the Royal School was heavy with technical manufacture and craft work designed for adult education, described as worthy work that replaced begging and allowed the blind, in quotes, to contribute to the production of trade goods. So again, we can see the emphasis on design and technical training that was then leading art education out of the art academy into design and technical training was also evident in the curriculum for the Royal School for the Blind. But I'd question, what do we know of the work produced there? There have been some archival projects which have sought to explore the work that was produced within the school, which I'll refer to. According to the recent Histories of Place project, craft work dominated in the Royal School for the Blind as a means of occupation. And this is to quote, "to forget the handicap of useless eyes." Craft, as the poor relation in art, craft and design, emerges then as busy work for docile bodies, although there is evidence that art, craft and design work produced in segregated settings was exhibited and valued. So for example, Robbins, writing in 1885, reported in the American Annals of the Deaf and Dumb on the quality of exhibits of deaf mutes made at the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition in New Orleans. So I think it's too problematic to say that the work was dismissed at the time. Probably the work was taken account of. And again, this is an attempt to further my argument. Although those histories and that work had a particular place, when we think about the development of a history of art education, those histories tend to be lost or occluded by these dominant histories. But I would say the institutionalisation of disabled people, in this case, reinforces the separation of art, craft and design along the lines of able/disabled, elite fine art, design/manufacture and occupational craft. Those making a productive contribution defined as central to the country's economic pursuits, whilst others are engaged in remedial busy work. So, part 4, I'm going to move now to subjects on the edge. So if we can just get our heads out of the 1830s, back in the room, the phrase I'd use here is, how do we bring this past to the future without a DeLorean? And I don't know if I have to explain that joke, but I don't. Some people laugh, so that was okay. Futurity then requires us to take account of the present so we can return to our trilogy of art, education and disability. So I'm just bringing us back into our current situation now, before I move into this conclusion where I'm thinking about dystopian and utopian futures. So we have our words here, our ideas, art, education and disability, and Berardi's vibratory concurrence of many possibilities, with a continued emphasis on capitalist means of production and consumption that impact on our definitions of all three. So I'm saying basically the dominance of a capitalist ideology has framed the way we think around art, education and disability, and that is evident in the present moment. Recent austerity measures in the UK, born out of late capitalist neoliberal politics, that have had a significant negative impact on the lives of disabled people, have also gone to work on art education via the English Baccalaureate, or EBAC. And for people who maybe are less familiar with that, that's the prioritisation in schools, where schools have to account for the results of their pupils, and they're required to study STEM, so the science subjects, and there's a reduction in the uptake of creative arts subjects because schools are not persuaded to encourage pupils to engage with those studies. The arts are designated less productive subjects in this context. The echoes of neoliberalism, evident in the politics of disablement, then pervade this context of art education. Of the three ideas here, education then becomes a problematic set of structures. And on the slide, I'm attempting to illustrate this idea of education as this huge set of concepts and ideas, regulations, ways of framing the way we think about learning. So I'm not thinking about learning, I'm thinking about these educational structures that are pushing art and disability to the edge, hence the naming of this particular section, Subjects on the Edge. So of the three ideas here, education emerges as a problematic idea that creates art and disability as subjects on the edge. The current context for disability in education, the current context for special educational needs in particular, is difficult at the moment, to say the least. The Department for Education statistics in January 2019 revealed an increase in young people with so-called special educational needs, with 8,000 children outside education and an increasing number being off-rolled. And this again is a system where schools can remove certain pupils from their number in order to artificially inflate or report on pupil achievement. And there's been a significant increase in that activity over the last 12 months, 2 years. This current context then appears hostile for disabled children and young people. This is the politics of disablement at work, where philosophical arguments about the type of art education received become irrelevant. How can art education learn from body minds when they are not present? Part 5. So this is to conclude and to think about disability futurity and art education. And I'm going to offer two possibilities, but of course there are more, and it's always problematic in being offered as a simplistic binary. But we have to remember then Berardi's question. Why is it, among all possibilities of development, one of them prevails? Why is it, amongst all possibilities, that we have a situation currently where a significant number of pupils are outside of education, when there were a range of possibilities that were open to us? I'm going to start, so I thought, should I start with a dystopian or utopian? I think we'll end on a high, and we'll end with the utopian view. So if you just bear with me while I go down... Oh, sorry. Thanks. I was getting carried away from the camera. Okay. So we're into our dystopian future. There's a continued dominance here of a very limited concept of education that prioritises particular types of ability and productivity over others. The education sector in this dystopian future is further fragmented with increasing demand for specific segregated provision for body minds that are beyond the limited concept of education fostered by a system of mainstream education that is emerging as being damaging and hostile. And in this dystopian future, we recognise that that environment is damaging and hostile to teachers as well as to pupils. Definitions of ability in art education continue to reinforce an idea that creative practice is for a select few, freeing the rest of us to become active consumers of diminishing resources. Why would we want to waste our time making things? We've been convinced in this dystopian future that we're no good at art, we can't function in those creative ways, and we're freed up to become consumers of diminishing resources. We're rendered uncreative, unable to make and respond, and our time can then be spent serving the machinery of capitalism as consumers of all and makers of nought. And that's a bit of Lancashire dialect. There are hard distinctions between who is defined as an artist and who is not. All hail the cry, I can't draw. Art market reinforces and commodifies practice, which is preserved as an elite occupation. We choose not to make stuff because ability in art is defined along limited and limiting aesthetic principles. Art education drags its anachronistic practices with it into this future. Assessment regimes configure art practice into a distinct and irrelevant school activity. As Gert Biester warns, art education loses its capacity to be art and to be education. The arts lose their creative case for diversity. Somewhere in Liverpool, an art teacher works with a scale from 1 to 9. She marks a child's drawing 1+. But other possibilities prevail. There are some good vibrations in a utopian future where art is recognised for its intrinsic educational capacity and frees itself from the productive and oppressive machinery of education. Art is acknowledged as a way of being that values the centrality of experience, our experiences of being in the world, in whatever forms that takes, inclusive of and learning from diverse experience and representations. Art is open to and with the other. The thoughts of Tobin Siebers continue to inform our practice in this utopian future, with an acceptance of disability that enriches and complicates notions of the aesthetic. We spend more time making and less time questioning the value of what we make. We are concerned with art as a powerful bridge between our individual and social lives. Art offers powerful points of recognition between one and an other. In our present, though, we are always stepping into our future. So Berardi talking about and now, and now, and now. We're stepping into that future. We recognise then that this utopia is offered in small points of resistance when an art teacher questions a definition of ability that conflicts with her philosophy of art and her openness to enriched and complicated notions of an aesthetic. In this utopian futurity, somewhere in an art room in a school in Liverpool, she says, "I love this drawing. It's a 1+. It goes to 9. I think it goes to 11. Thank you.